Prince William firmly believed that every single surviving word from his late mother had already been thoroughly examined, heavily protected, and securely placed far beyond the unpredictable reach of palace politics. He was completely mistaken. Hidden deep inside a securely sealed archive box, royal officials unexpectedly discovered a highly private document bearing Diana's unmistakable signature, along with one final, devastating message addressed directly to her beloved sons. When William finally read its haunting closing lines, he slowly lowered the page, tightly gripped the edge of the table, and suddenly realized his mother had deeply feared the exact same division that was now defining their fractured lives. Before we go deeper into exactly what this historic discovery really means for the British royal family, make absolutely sure to subscribe right now so you do not miss a single important update. Prince William remained absolutely motionless as the heavy meaning fully settled over him. Palace archivists had actually uncovered the forgotten envelope during a routine security review of highly private correspondence securely stored at Windsor Castle. An archive is essentially a heavily guarded, secure collection where tremendously important historical records are carefully preserved for the future. This particular message carried Diana's genuine signature, her own handwritten corrections, and one very clear, undeniable instruction. Both of her sons were meant to receive it only once. They were finally old enough to properly understand the immense royal burden waiting for them. The prince quietly returned to the very opening line, then painfully forced himself toward the specific sentence that had completely broken his earlier calm. Diana strongly urged William to always protect Harry, but she also seriously warned him to never surrender his own conscience under any circumstances. She directly asked the brothers not to let the crown, which represents the ultimate authority and immense public duty permanently attached to the monarch, turn their deep love into bitter rivalry. Reaching toward, Harry could successfully honor their late mother, but it also heavily risked public accusations, deeply private disclosures, and completely renewed family conflict. William kept on reading, and the underlying message grew progressively darker. Diana explicitly warned that powerful, unseen figures might someday actively encourage division, simply because two deeply isolated brothers would be significantly easier to guide, heavily pressure, and completely control. Her officially documented words did not actually name those specific figures, but the dire warning felt disturbingly close to the actual life her sons were currently living right now. One brother stood firmly inside his demanding royal duty. The other had successfully built his entire future far beyond it. Somewhere strictly between them, prolonged silence had hardened into a massive barrier that neither man seemed able to cross. The senior palace archivist carefully watched. William finally reached the very last page and quietly asked whether Prince Harry should be officially contacted immediately. The prince slowly placed the fragile document completely flat against the wooden table and closely studied the attached custody record affixed to its cover. It clearly proved the envelope had officially entered palace protection many years earlier. Diana had fully intended for both of her sons to receive it. Yet, someone behind the scenes had repeatedly prevented that important moment from ever happening. Not until I know exactly who kept this hidden from us, William stated firmly. The archivist slowly lowered his eyes as the prince carefully traced an old reference number sitting right beside the final authorization stamp. That specific number directly connected Diana's hidden message to an administrative office that was still actively operating near the very heart of royal authority. Her prophetic words had violently reopened William's deeply suppressed grief, but their complicated hidden history was now about to force both brothers to finally confront the vastly different lives they had built without them. Diana's final heartfelt message did not reach the two frightened young boys, who once stood bravely together behind their mother's funeral coffin. Instead, it reached a fully grown men who were now completely separated by a massive ocean, years of bitter resentment and hurtful words that could never be taken back or withdrawn. William heavily carried the immense burden of eventually becoming king. Harry stubbornly carried the firm belief that the royal institution had completely abandoned him. Now, their late mother's voice had suddenly returned, actively asking each son to save a fractured bond. Neither man seemed certain that bond could still actually be rescued. William clearly understood exactly why every single choice now felt incredibly dangerous. As the direct heir, meaning the specific person expected to eventually inherit the throne, he carried heavy responsibilities extending far beyond his own personal feelings. His consequential decisions directly affected Catherine, their young children, and the overall stability of the British monarchy he had spent many years fiercely protecting. Calling Harry might immediately reopen public accusations, incredibly angry arguments, and deeply private wounds. Staying completely silent, however, would simply repeat the exact toxic pattern Diana had explicitly warned against. Either difficult choice threatened something extremely valuable that the prince simply could not afford to lose. Harry currently faced a completely different struggle. The Duke had successfully built an entirely new life far beyond strict royal control. Yet, his core identity remained intimately tied to his late mother. his royal childhood, and the older brother who had once equally shared his profound grief. Diana's officially documented message now spoke directly to that deeply hidden conflict. She strongly warned him not to blindly mistake open rebellion for actual freedom, because successfully escaping an ancient institution meant very little if unresolved anger continued, completely controlling his daily life. Those exact words directly threatened the personal narrative story he had been telling himself for many years. Catherine immediately noticed the significant change in his demeanor long before William said a single word. She quietly found him, obsessively reading the exact same paragraph repeatedly, his tense fingers firmly fixed against the edge of the paper page. The princess gently touched his shoulder and patiently waited until he finally looked up at her. He slowly admitted that Diana's haunting words made him feel as though he had completely failed twice over. First, as Harry's older brother, and then again, as the future king who was always expected to successfully hold his entire family together. William walked slowly toward the window without ever releasing his tight grip on the document. Catherine closely followed him, but wisely did not press for specific details. She simply asked one very quiet question. Did he actually want true reconciliation, or did he simply want a reasonable explanation for absolutely everything that had happened? The prince stared straight ahead and confessed that he no longer honestly knew whether the two concepts could even be separated. Understanding Harry might strictly require deep forgiveness, but that same forgiveness could demand significantly more trust than either brother still actually possessed. The hidden message then clearly delivered its most emotionally painful instruction. Diana had thoughtfully written separate lines for each individual son, but a later handwritten edition firmly declared that they absolutely must hear her final words together. Sending Harry a simple copy would directly violate that specific request. Delaying any contact would only deepen the dark secrecy currently surrounding it. William now faced an impossible choice in which even the most careful, deliberate path felt exactly clear's throat like a bitter betrayal. A senior palace aide entered mere moments later and directly handed him the official archival record, which was a formal written history clearly showing exactly when a historical document was initially received, heavily restricted, and secretly moved. William intensely studied its very first entry, and suddenly went completely still. Diana's personal message had been officially logged immediately following a highly tense family meeting many years earlier. To truly understand why her desperate plea disappeared, William would now have to mentally return to the exact palace moment when prolonged silence became a highly deliberate choice. The suspicious disappearance of Diana's final message was definitely not caused by a simple misplaced storage box or a careless junior clerk. It truly began during one highly specific closed-door meeting when immense grief, strict royal caution, and deep fear of public scandal violently collided behind a heavily locked palace door. The two brothers were still very young boys. The British monarchy was actively struggling to survive intense public anger, and senior palace figures truly believed they were protecting the fragile future. But one fateful decision made that very afternoon would successfully deny both William and Harry the final comforting words their mother had specifically left for them. William closely studied the newly recovered official register and carefully followed its written entries back to the chaotic months immediately following Diana's tragic death. Her vast private correspondence had been carefully divided between her personal representatives, royal family custodians, and official palace archivists. These dedicated archivists were highly trained officials, strictly responsible for protecting incredibly important royal records and tightly controlling exactly who could examine them. Personal letters directly involving her sons received heavily additional security because senior palace advisors genuinely feared that highly painful family details could permanently damage the young boys or significantly deepen public anger toward the struggling monarchy. The official register clearly revealed something much darker. Diana's final message had been secretly placed under a highly restricted classification, which was a severe security label that completely prevented ordinary staff members or royal family members from accessing it without explicit formal permission. Palace officials internally justified that strict restriction because the private letter explicitly mentioned the crown, growing family division, and the immense emotional pressure surrounding William and Harry. Yet, the documented account clearly showed that basic protection was definitely not the only concern. Senior figures also deeply feared exactly what the powerful message might make the young brothers believe about hidden palace influence. October of 1997 quickly became the major turning point. A high-ranking private secretary officially opened Diana's sealed envelope during a highly classified meeting at St. James's Palace and nervously read part of it aloud. The secretary served as a very senior official who actively managed all confidential communication for the entire royal household. One chief advisor immediately warned that the letter's harsh criticism of outside royal control could permanently turn the young princes against the ancient institution. The entire room fell completely silent. Then, the envelope was strictly ordered into temporary sealed custody, meaning absolutely nobody could legally release it until another formal decision was eventually made. King Charles sat quietly through that entire meeting while carrying immense grief, deep personal guilt, and an absolutely impossible responsibility. Advisors firmly told him that giving the harsh message to William and Harry could significantly intensify their inner anger while they were still heavily struggling with their mother's sudden death. He reluctantly permitted a long delay. The newly crowned king genuinely believed the severe restriction would last only until his young sons were finally emotionally prepared to handle the weight of her words. But absolutely no specific date was ever fixed. No formal review was ever scheduled. And what began as temporary caution quietly transformed into permanent, suffocating silence. Prince William felt his deep anger sharpen considerably as he finally reached the concluding section. The official archival sheet clearly carried 3 distinct authorization marks. Yet one specific name had later been deliberately hidden beneath an entirely different security classification. Even worse, an unknown person had secretly renewed the harsh restriction long after both brothers had successfully reached full adulthood. The prince carefully spread the heavy register right beside Diana's handwritten message and darkly circled the exact renewal date. He recognized the significance immediately. That specific confidentiality order had been officially signed during the exact same week he and Harry had publicly appeared united at a high-profile memorial ceremony honoring their late mother. William abruptly closed the secure file and immediately requested a completely private meeting with King Charles. Absolutely no secretaries were allowed, and no royal advisors were permitted. The deeply buried letter was no longer merely Diana's final farewell. It was concrete evidence the future king would now carry directly into the most emotionally painful confrontation of his entire royal life. Prince William entered the quiet room carrying only 2 single sheets of paper. But the invisible weight resting between father and son was significantly heavier than any international state crisis. King Charles clearly saw Diana's familiar signature before a single spoken question was ever asked. For several tense seconds, absolutely neither man moved a muscle. Then the prince firmly placed the historical document on the wooden desk and loudly demanded the unfiltered truth. Had his father actively known that Diana's final message actually existed, while his own son spent long decades truly believing she had left absolutely no final words for them? King Charles quickly dismissed the last remaining aide and personally closed the heavy wooden door himself. His private sitting room was normally considered a highly personal space, used for confidential conversations completely away from formal royal business. William had specifically chosen this location because he absolutely wanted no palace secretaries recording careful, calculated answers and no senior advisors softening any painful truths. This specific discussion would strictly remain entirely between a father and his son. The monarch looked again at Diana's elegant handwriting, slowly lowered himself into a nearby chair, and quietly admitted that he definitely remembered the pivotal 1997 meeting. William felt hot anger rapidly rise as his father slowly explained exactly what happened. Charles had been firmly told that immediately releasing the emotional message could significantly deepen the young boy's profound grief and ultimately turn their private pain against the ancient institution. He truly believed the temporary restriction would naturally end when they were much older and fully emotionally ready. Yet reaching adulthood had not successfully healed either wounded brother. The prince angrily said it had merely taught them to expertly hide their inner wounds, while continuously smiling through rigid royal duty, which was the demanding public work performed by senior members of the royal family on behalf of the ruling monarch and the country. King Charles visibly flinched at the harsh accusation. William was absolutely no longer speaking to him as a distant future king, politely seeking an official explanation. He was speaking strictly as a wounded son who had been completely denied his beloved mother's final words. The reigning monarch slowly admitted that overwhelming fear had actively shaped far too many critical choices immediately following Diana's tragic death. Protecting the vulnerable institution had slowly become completely impossible to separate from actively avoiding grief, personnel blame and difficult conversations that absolutely nobody inside the palace ever wanted to face. The king then finally broke his lingering silence through that intensely private conversation and carefully disclosed something William had absolutely never heard before. Many years after the original 1997 meeting, Charles had actively asked why the private letter still remained securely sealed. A highly senior official confidently told him that Diana's personal legal representatives had explicitly withdrawn it from public release. The newly discovered official archive record definitively proved that specific explanation was completely false. Her actual representatives had never once requested any withdrawal. William forcefully pushed the second sheet completely across the wooden desk and pointed directly to the obscured authorization mark. Charles instantly recognized it immediately. It clearly belonged to a former senior courtier, who was a highly powerful palace advisor working tirelessly behind the scenes to actively guide major royal decisions. That specific official's hidden office had successfully retained immense influence long after the original 1997 meeting, secretly allowing the temporary restriction to survive indefinitely without any fresh formal approval. William abruptly shoved back his heavy chair and quickly walked toward the wooden door. Charles desperately called out his name. The prince momentarily stopped, but stubbornly refused to turn around. "I truly should have made absolutely certain you received it," the king stated extremely quietly. William quickly left the room, firmly knowing his father had initially made the very first mistake, but someone else entirely had deliberately kept that mistake alive for decades. Charles's emotional confession slightly softened one deep wound, yet simultaneously exposed a significantly colder truth. An unelected, invisible palace hand had successfully controlled Diana's powerful voice long after her sons had fully grown into men. The absolute most powerful figure in this entire story was definitely not the person who originally wrote the message, the grieving sons who were explicitly meant to receive it, or even the ruling king who completely failed to release it. Real, undeniable control belonged to a terrifyingly quiet palace office, entirely capable of permanently locking away a deeply private truth under the convenient language of royal protection. As William closely followed the complicated authorization trail, he shockingly discovered exactly how the deep fear of Diana's continuing posthumous influence had been magically transformed into rigid procedure, official signatures, and decades of highly deliberate silence. William carefully traced the secretly renewed restriction directly to a former courtier who had heavily controlled all access to highly sensitive family correspondence, and actively advised the royal household on perceived threats to long-term royal stability. A courtier was traditionally considered a highly trusted palace official who worked incredibly close to the ruling monarch and could heavily influence major decisions without ever holding any actual public authority. This specific man had absolutely not merely stored Diana's private message. He had personally decided exactly how her powerful words might negatively affect the monarchy, then actively used that personal judgment to keep them permanently away from her sons. The prince felt completely betrayed by the very system he was eventually expected to inherit. That exact system aggressively demanded his absolute loyalty, unwavering discipline, and total silence. Yet, it had maliciously withheld something deeply personal while constantly claiming to protect him. The former official had quietly retired many years earlier, but the harsh restriction remained fully active simply because no later private secretary ever dared to challenge it. A private secretary actively managed all highly confidential royal business and could officially review incredibly sensitive decisions. In this specific case, every single successor had blindly allowed an outdated old order to survive without ever asking whether it was still actually justified. King Charles reacted with obvious quiet shame when William directly showed him the secretly renewed authorization. The sitting king suddenly discovered that his royal authority had repeatedly been falsely cited, even though he had absolutely never personally reviewed or officially approved the long extension. His powerful name had given the harsh restriction immense weight, while his complete failure to question the flawed process had successfully allowed others to control Diana's voice. He had definitely made the very first mistake. The powerful office had permanently turned it into institutional policy. Princess Catherine then suddenly noticed a second envelope number faintly hidden beneath a heavily handwritten correction. The princess carefully compared it with the official archive register and shockingly discovered that Diana's original message actually contained an accompanying page. That specific page was currently missing. Its official entry clearly described it as highly personal instructions, directly suggesting it might fully explain exactly when, where, and under what specific conditions the brothers were originally meant to receive the letter. William soon found another highly disturbing clue hidden inside a formal memorandum, which was a formal internal note typically used to carefully record official palace reasoning. It strongly argued that publicly releasing Diana's honest words might actively encourage her sons to place personal family loyalty far above strict constitutional responsibility, meaning their official duty to protect the monarchy's rules and overall stability. The internal statement completely twisted a grieving mother's earnest plea for family unity into a direct threat against the crown. The quiet archive chamber offered absolutely no real answers. William closely watched the current official custodian slowly unlock a very narrow drawer, exactly where the second folder should have been safely stored. Inside sat only a small faded card bearing 3 terrifying words: removed by authority. The angry prince firmly set it down and immediately demanded a completely comprehensive custody search. Before palace officials could even begin the search, Prince Harry unexpectedly received a private call from a highly private contact. He quickly learned that Diana's hidden message had finally been found, and that William had still not personally contacted him. The palace had strictly controlled the massive secret for several decades, but the exact moment the Duke felt deliberately excluded again, institutional control rapidly began slipping completely from everyone's hands. Harry did absolutely not first hear Diana's actual words directly from his older brother. He initially heard that they even existed from a random person outside the locked room, where the critical decisions were actively being made. That specific detail struck him with almost as much emotional force as the actual hidden message itself. To him, the painful discovery completely confirmed a very old, lingering fear. When the royal palace faced a highly dangerous truth, William was always brought securely inside while he remained completely beyond the locked door. Within mere minutes, profound grief rapidly transformed into burning anger. And that intense anger immediately demanded a clear answer. Prince Harry unexpectedly received the highly sensitive information through a secretive private call originating from a deeply trusted contact, intimately familiar with the ongoing archive search. The anonymous caller explicitly told him that Prince William had already read a securely sealed message, privately written by Princess Diana to both of her sons, and that senior palace officials were actively investigating exactly why it had been deliberately suppressed for so long. A genuinely sealed message was essentially a highly protected, official document, strictly kept completely closed to any unauthorized readers. Yet the official explanation offered absolutely no emotional comfort to him. The Duke distinctly heard only one undeniable fact. Crucial decisions regarding his beloved mother were actively happening once again, entirely without his involvement or knowledge. William had consciously delayed making any direct contact for two specific reasons. Diana's explicit handwritten instructions strictly required both brothers to physically hear the emotional message together, and the mysteriously missing accompanying page heavily raised serious doubts about whether the historical discovery was actually complete. The prince deeply wanted to fiercely protect the fragile document's absolute integrity, meaning the absolute certainty that its internal contents were completely original, fully complete, and entirely unchanged. But his prolonged silence had unfortunately created the exact same deep wound their late mother had explicitly warned against. Every passing hour of careful caution now unfortunately looked exactly like another deliberate act of institutional control. Harry immediately called his older brother directly. His tight voice noticeably shook as he fiercely demanded to know exactly why palace archivists, senior advisors, and powerful royal officials had ever been allowed to arbitrarily decide, precisely, when he was emotionally ready to finally hear his mother's private words. William desperately tried to carefully explain the mystery of the missing page, but the angry Duke abruptly cut him off. He had spent many long years truly believing the royal institution maliciously controlled sensitive information solely to protect itself. Now, his own brother, unfortunately, appeared to be actively standing inside that exact same secretive circle. The tense conversation suddenly shifted dramatically when Harry, unexpectedly, revealed something deeply personal through that private call. Princess Diana had once firmly told him to absolutely never let anyone ever convince him that William had permanently stopped loving him. He had silently carried those exact words entirely privately for many years, even throughout the absolute bitterest periods of their highly public disputes. Far more importantly, he actually possessed an incredibly old handwritten note, containing a specific phrase that might perfectly authenticate the missing page. The phrase was, "Stand beside each other by choice." William deeply felt the profound meaning immediately. The specific phrase perfectly matched the underlying emotional direction of the recently recovered letter and could definitively prove that Harry's hidden note genuinely belonged to the exact same final message. It might also fully explain exactly why senior palace officials historically considered Diana's private instructions so incredibly dangerous. She had absolutely not ordered blind loyalty to the crown, which represented the ultimate authority and immense public duty surrounding the ruling monarch. Instead, she had clearly placed the twin brothers' absolute free choice far above rigid palace pressure. William quickly closed the heavy library door, firmly dismissed the patiently waiting royal aide, and immediately called Harry back without absolutely anyone secretly listening. Heavy silence stretched between them before the prince finally spoke up. "We strictly read it together, or absolutely neither of us reads another single word." Harry quickly agreed to meet entirely privately, but firmly imposed one non-negotiable condition. William must personally bring the original historical document and completely leave the heavy crown outside the closed room. For the absolute first time in several years, they actively prepared to meet strictly, not as a senior prince and a distant duke. A royal title was traditionally given to a senior male family member, but tonight they met simply and purely as Diana's two grieving sons. There were absolutely no royal advisors present in the quiet room, no paparazzi cameras waiting impatiently outside, and absolutely no official palace statement carefully prepared in advance. William quietly arrived, physically carrying the original sealed message. Harry securely brought the small handwritten note he had fiercely protected for many years. They quietly sat directly opposite each other, simply as brothers, deeply divided by highly public battles, but permanently joined by the exact same deeply unfinished grief. When William slowly began reading Diana's heartfelt words aloud, the bitter anger between them definitely did not magically disappear. But for the absolute first time, it was heavily forced to openly share the quiet room with genuine love. William had intelligently chosen a highly private residence, situated far away from formal, heavily monitored palace offices. Both brothers firmly agreed that absolutely nothing said inside that room would ever be used in future public attacks or official institutional briefings, which were formal meetings where senior palace staff actively shaped major decisions, public responses, and official statements. This specific rule mattered immensely because fragile trust between them had repeatedly collapsed entirely. Whenever deeply private pain became highly public material, tonight, absolutely neither the ancient monarchy nor the global media would be allowed to speak for them. They would directly answer strictly only to each other and to their late mother, whose powerful words had finally successfully brought them back together. The prince slowly read the fragile document exactly as Diana had originally written it. She strongly urged her beloved sons to openly challenge one another, completely honestly, fully forgive without ever surrendering personal dignity, and always remember that rigid royal duty or vast physical distance could never truly erase their deeply shared childhood. Her powerful message did absolutely not ask them to blindly agree on absolutely everything. It simply asked them to truly recognize the deeply wounded human being hiding directly behind every grand royal title, public accusation, and prolonged angry silence. Harry slowly lowered his eyes when one specific sentence clearly warned that unresolved pain could tragically turn blood brothers into mere political symbols instead of real, feeling people. Through their intensely private conversation, the Duke honestly admitted that he had definitely sometimes spoken publicly about William exactly as though his older brother were merely the cold face of a faceless institution. Doing exactly that had certainly made his personal anger significantly easier to publicly express, but it had also unfortunately allowed him to completely forget the young boy who had once intimately shared his profound grief, when absolutely nobody else in the world could truly understand it. William quietly answered with a painful confession of his very own. The future king openly acknowledged that fiercely protecting the ancient monarchy had definitely sometimes given him a convenient excuse to actively avoid highly difficult, emotional conversations. Total silence had slowly become his strongest protective shield. It effectively prevented fresh, heated arguments. But it had also permanently left Harry truly believing that rigid royal duty mattered significantly more than their unbreakable blood bond. The prince had defensively called that silence mature restraint. Diana's honest message completely exposed it as deep fear. Harry carefully unfolded his old handwritten note and gently placed it directly beside the missing line in the official archival copy. The written words completed the broken sentence absolutely perfectly. Stand beside each other by choice, never by command. Suddenly, the hidden reason for maliciously suppressing the accompanying page became completely clear. It was absolutely not a coordinated political attack on the crown. It was purely Diana's deeply private belief that true family reconciliation genuinely had meaning strictly only when deep love was freely chosen. William quietly finished reading, carefully folded the fragile document, and gently placed it directly between them. Harry physically moved his heavy chair significantly closer instead of aggressively reaching for the page. Absolutely, neither brother offered a grand sweeping apology or confidently promised instant, lasting peace. They simply and firmly agreed that their late mother's powerful words would absolutely never be leaked, publicly distorted, or maliciously used as a weapon against either brother. Their personal decision was strictly private. Its inevitable consequences, however, would absolutely not remain so. The two brothers had finally heard Diana's true voice together, but the outside world was rapidly about to discover exactly how incredibly long her voice had been kept securely hidden behind thick palace walls. By sunrise, a deeply private family reckoning had completely transformed into a massive national story. The massive public revelation unexpectedly touched something significantly deeper than ordinary royal curiosity, primarily because it forcefully returned all of Britain directly back to the profoundly unresolved grief surrounding Princess Diana and the two painfully young sons who bravely walked behind her moving coffin. Yet this specific time, the grieving public was definitely not simply mourning the tragic past. People actively wanted to exactly know why a loving mother's desperate final plea had been heavily restricted, precisely, who secretly benefited from the brothers' deep division, and whether true family reconciliation had actually finally begun. The royal palace officially responded with a highly carefully worded public statement confirming that Diana's deeply personal correspondence had finally been found, professionally authenticated, and properly delivered jointly to both Prince William and Prince Harry. Personal correspondence explicitly meant private letters intended solely for family members rather than formal official government business. Authentication was defined as the rigorous process of definitively confirming that the specific handwriting, the personal signature, the physical paper, and the complete recorded history were all undeniably genuine. The official statement successfully protected the letter's deeply private contents, but its mere public confirmation completely shattered decades of absolute institutional silence. King Charles acted swiftly before public anger could spread any further. The reigning king officially ordered a fully independent review of exactly how highly sensitive family documents were historically classified. Such a formal review officially allowed experienced experts completely outside the original office responsible for the flawed decision to thoroughly examine exactly what had truly happened. He also firmly directed that absolutely no inherited restriction from any retired palace official could legally remain active without explicit fresh authorization. This specific decision mattered immensely because existing palace procedures had shockingly allowed one temporary administrative delay to completely control his sons' personal lives for several decades. Prince William deeply disliked seeing his late mother's private words maliciously turned into sensational public headlines. Yet he fully accepted that institutional secrecy had ultimately created this entire crisis. Prince Harry formally agreed through a publicly documented joint statement, absolutely not, to publish the complete private letter. The Duke clearly understood that publicly revealing absolutely everything might temporarily satisfy intense public curiosity, but it would also unfortunately transform Diana's sacred final message into just another public weapon. For once, both brothers wisely chose genuine protection without ever allowing the royal palace to control them. King Charles immediately faced incredibly fierce public criticism for personally permitting the original delay so long ago. He firmly refused to unfairly blame former royal courtiers alone. During a highly private conversation with William, the reigning monarch honestly admitted that true accountability, absolutely, had to begin directly with him simply because overwhelming fear had completely stopped him from ever checking whether the crucial message was actually delivered. The prince did not offer immediate forgiveness, but he clearly recognized something entirely different in his father. True responsibility offered completely without any excuse. Outside the gates of Kensington Palace, the massive public response rapidly became completely impossible to ignore. Emotional crowds actively gathered beside Diana's famous memorial gates, quietly leaving fresh flowers and deeply handwritten personal messages. One individual prominently raised a printed newspaper high above the somber gathering. Its bold front page prominently carried the chilling words, her final words, "Do not let them divide you." A major national broadcaster accurately described the historic discovery not as definitive proof of instant family reconciliation, but strictly as the very first major joint decision William and Harry had actually made together in several years. That specific difference truly mattered. The estranged brothers had definitely not erased their deep conflict. They had simply firmly refused to let outside forces control exactly what happened next. Prince William quietly watched the television report sitting beside Princess Catherine and abruptly switched off the screen when an old nostalgic photograph of himself and young Harry unexpectedly appeared. The princess gently asked whether he truly regretted meeting his estranged brother. "No," the future king finally answered quietly. "I only truly regret that it ultimately took her powerful voice to finally make us listen to each other." The massive headline effectively captured the initial shock, but strictly only Diana's sons could truly determine whether her powerful words became just another media controversy or a truly lasting act of family repair. Diana's private message could absolutely not restore the precious years her sons had tragically lost, completely erase the hurtful accusations publicly exchanged between them, or magically return them to the innocent closeness of their childhood. But it successfully achieved something that royal authority had repeatedly failed to accomplish. It finally made Prince William and Prince Harry directly face one another completely without their royal titles, mediating advisors, or carefully rehearsed public defenses. The true final meaning of the historical document was definitely not hidden inside one single dramatic sentence. It was fully revealed by exactly what the two brothers actively chose to do immediately after reading it. William quickly made the very first permanent decision. He officially ordered the original historical message securely placed inside a jointly controlled private family archive. This was a heavily protected collection, strictly requiring formal approval from both brothers before absolutely anything could be opened, copied, or publicly released. Absolutely neither the royal palace nor either son would ever control Diana's powerful words alone ever again. Their late mother's letter would strictly remain entirely private, but it would absolutely never again disappear behind an administrative decision neither man truly understood. King Charles quickly followed suit with a formal order of his very own. The king officially and formally removed the deeply flawed inherited restriction system that had legally allowed an outdated old classification to remain fully active without any modern review. An official archival review, meaning the formal official examination of exactly how historical records were securely stored and tightly controlled, successfully created a brand new rule permanently protecting deeply personal correspondence from indefinite, secretive institutional control. Future palace officials could still safely preserve highly sensitive material, but they could absolutely no longer hide it forever underneath another person's old authority. William finally understood that truly honoring Diana definitely did not require him to abandon his royal duty or completely forget the deep wounds Harry had caused. It strictly required, firmly refusing to let heavy royal responsibility become a convenient excuse for profound emotional distance. The future king could still fiercely defend the ancient monarchy while simultaneously recognizing his brother as beloved family. That delicate balance would definitely be incredibly difficult, but their mother had absolutely never promised them an easy path. Harry simultaneously reached an equally painful conclusion. The Duke finally accepted that true family reconciliation could absolutely not be forcefully demanded through televised interviews, aggressive public statements, or media pressure. He quietly agreed to slowly rebuild contact entirely privately and actively stopped turning every private conversation into damning evidence for one side. Fragile trust would return very slowly, if it ever returned at all. But intense disagreement would absolutely no longer mean complete, permanent abandonment. Diana's final message carried its immense power through careful balance. She had absolutely not asked William to blindly rescue his brother, nor had she ordered Harry to silently accept every single royal decision. She simply asked both sons to actively remain fully human when rigid duty, intense anger, and harsh public judgment aggressively pushed them into opposing roles. Deep love, she gently reminded them, could successfully survive intense disagreement. Strictly only when absolutely neither person actively tried to completely control it. William gently returned the fragile handwritten note before their intense final private conversation officially ended. Harry quietly closed his older brother's fingers tightly around it and softly said the page rightfully belonged beside the original. Together, they carefully placed both historical pieces inside the very same envelope. King Charles then officially apologized personally to both of his sons through a highly private family conversation. His emotional apology could absolutely not restore the missing decades, but it definitively ended the royal palace's long denial of any responsibility. Diana's final message arrived painfully late, yet its true purpose was finally fulfilled. Her sons ultimately chose not perfect, flawless unity, but strict honesty, mutual dignity, and a deep blood bond that absolutely no palace document would ever control again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.